Hi, today we're going to be going over the concept of weighted average, and to review this, we're going to be solving two simple question sets. To start off, what is a weighted average and why is it important? Differently from a normal average where you would just calculate the output divided by input, the weighted average actually takes account to how impactful each input is. So for example, let's say that you have a business model where you are a retailer, and for every item sold on a credit card, you have to pay a certain fee. So this is the data that you're kind of seeing right here. We have items sold, we have the total sales amount for the item, and then we have the vendor that is our credit card service provider. For each sale generated on these credit cards, we have to pay a certain percentage, which then results into a fee that we have to pay the vendor. As a company with this business model, you want to know exactly how much you're actually paying to these vendors and which vendors are contributing to most of the fees that we're paying out. So we have the rate percentage here, and without a weighted average, if we were to just calculate the average of this percentage, we would get around 0.15%. But this doesn't actually take account the amount sold. So for example, if Capital One had 0.11%, but Visa had 0.23%, and let's say, for example, we sold around 100,000 with Visa versus 10,000 with Capital One, the actual weighted average rate would skew more towards the 0.23% because we sold more under the vendor Visa. So let's go through two examples to calculate the weighted average and see how this actually provides us value. Question 1 requires us to calculate the average fee rate and then provide a breakdown by vendor. So let's actually calculate the average of the rates first, which is incorrect, but we'll leave this here, and then we can kind of use this as a comparison to see what the difference between average and weighted average is. So to actually calculate the average fee rate, rather than calculating the average of the rate percentage here, we want to take account the amount sold and the fee that we've paid. So for the vendor, I'm going to do this very manually. Let's copy this list of vendors here. I am going to paste special and paste values, then go to data, remove duplicates, and then I'm going to press OK. So now I have the unique vendors, and for the amount, I'm going to use a SUMIFS to calculate the total amount paid by each vendor. And then we have to do the same for the fee as well. And then lastly, for the rate, I'm just going to divide fee by the amount. And here we can see that the weighted average is actually a bit higher than the average. And this is because the vendors with a higher rate, we've realized a higher amount and fee under these vendors. For example, MasterCard, the rate that we're paying them is around 0.1983%, which is above the average, and the amount that we've realized with them is pretty significant. So now we have the weighted average of 0.1541%. But one thing you'll notice is that if we average the rate here, it doesn't actually get us to the 0.1541%. because these rates are just their individual rates. It's not relative to the total sales amount generated. So the way we actually calculate weighted rate is to apply their individual rate and multiply it against their relative percentage from the total. So the weighted rate would actually be the individual rate times their amount divided by the base. So then let's expand this to 4 decimal places. And once we sum this up, it will get us to the same total of 0.1541%. And based on the values here, we know that we are paying a significant amount to MasterCard. We are also paying a significant amount to Visa because the rate is so much higher, whereas all the other vendors are not too significant. So by calculating the weighted average of 0.1541%, and breaking it down by different components, we can more accurately identify different drivers to this average. Now let's move on to question 2, which is a bit more complicated. We need to calculate the average sale per unit of item for both 2020 and 2024 and provide a breakdown per product that is contributing to the growth from 2020 to 2024. So the very first thing that we're going to do is just bring in the headers. This time I'm going to bring in the item by using the unique function, which is a more dynamic way of bringing in unique values. And this time, instead of actually calculating the 2020 amount by the item first, I'm actually going to just calculate the total based on the year. So the year would be 2020. Sales would be total sales here. And then this time, instead of 2020, we need 2024. So the 2020 average sale per unit is about $66, whereas 2020, it's about $83. So now we need to identify exactly which items are contributing to the growth of about $16.64. So let's call this difference. So let's first bring in the amount by the item. And then the year is going to be 2020. Let's move this to assess the sales. And a really useful trick here is you can use the replace function to replace specific inputs in your formula. You'll notice that anytime I want to replace 2020, instead of going in the formula and then changing it to 2024, I just highlight the range that I want to edit, press Ctrl H. I want to find 2020, replace with 2024, press replace all. And it will automatically update all your 2020 inputs to 2024. Just a neat trick if you ever want to use it. So now we have average sales per unit. So we're going to divide sales by the amount. And then again with 2 decimal places. And I do the same here as well. So if we assess the average over here, again, it's not going to get you the 66.37. So we need to, again, add one more column. And for here, we're going to assess the weighted average sale per unit. So like we did before, we need to calculate the average sale per individual unit times the relative total. This time our base is going to be the amount sold. So I'm just going to multiply the average sale per unit by the base amount divided by the total. And then when I calculate the total here, again, gets us to the 66.37. So we can copy this formula over. And again, we have the average of 83.01. So then to break down the difference of which of these items are making up the growth in average sales per unit of $16.64, we just have to calculate the difference between our calculated weighted average sale per unit in 2024 minus 2020. And then when we calculate the total here, gets us to the 16.64. And we can see that for hoodies, although the average sale per unit went up, in 2024 it's about $104 per hoodie, whereas in 2020 it's about $85. We actually undersold the amount, where in 2024 we sold about 2,126, whereas in 2020 we sold 2,207. So from a total revenue perspective, hoodies did not increase the average sale per unit as much as it did in 2020. So that's why you'll see a difference of around negative $5. However, for windbreakers, we greatly exceeded what we sold in 2020. We sold about 1,400, whereas in 2024, we sold almost 2,900, which is almost double. So you'll notice that it is contributing a lot to the growth in average sale per unit. The concept of weighting in financial analysis is very common because they don't really care about just the average. they need to know exactly which components are driving the growth in revenue. I highly recommend that you try these problems yourself. They will be available on my website, and this will be a very useful exercise for you to get familiar with the concept of weighted average capital. Always feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I'm going to continue uploading more educational content, so follow for more.